Amidst the bustling of Russell City, a weirdly deformed creature resembling a cluster of female breasts wreaks havoc. However, a Makite knight with the duty to slay such creatures guards the city. A man with a massive frame, a huge appetite and a taste for women with large busts sword. Meanwhile, a red-haired girl, Sophie Hennis, wanders around the city's district laden with trunker, searching for a certain El Dorado. Tapping away at her phone, she receives a message from the Moon Wizard, a fortune teller. She had been hoping to get information from. She makes her way to a desolate house she's directed to and makes the harsh discovery of the fortune teller being a human-hungry creature hunting women with red hair. However, to her luck, Sword arrives and makes the creatures scurry away. The two get familiar with each other at a diner where Sword informs Sophie that such creatures are called horror and the one after her is likely to return to its target. Sophie also meets Aruba, Sword's partner, a Matagi entity that has guided all Macan knights with the Garo title and armor. Agreeing to bait the horror in, Sword and Sophie work together at a remote place. They manage to find the horror once again. To Sophie's surprise, Sword questions the horror about El Dorado while fighting it. As the horror transforms to its true form, Sword drops off Sophie safely and together with Zaruba on his bike leads the horror to a bridge, brandishing his magnificent Garo armor, gold and glowing with purple circuit lights. He brings out his massive sword, blowing the horror into a fuel truck and finishing him off with an explosion. As the people panic over the explosion and the dead horror, a Mackay alchemist, Luke, overlooks the city and summons rain. The shower wipes the memory of the crowd, restoring the peace. Luke arrives at the diner and bickers with Sword to not be careless or involve common people in missions. Sophie, who had missed the rain, luckily is discharged from the hospital and resumes her search, this time determined to find Sword as well. At the diner, the duo of Luke and Sword is complimented by the boss through the waitress. She brings a cake. A Mackay alchemist, a beautiful buxom woman, Gina, infiltrates the headquarters of a gang boss, Damien, striking down whoever comes in her way. She reaches her target floor but fails to enter and retreats. Meanwhile, Sword is swooned in by a prostitute. Seeing her breasts, he clasped his hand in a grateful prayer but is crashed by Gina's entrance. The two of them catch up at a bar with Sword lusting over Gina, indicating they had an intimate relationship. Jimin explains how Damien might have allied with an information providing horror to rise to the top and needs a hand in the mission. Plus, Sword might benefit from the horror and get info on El Dorado. At a combined meeting of gangs planning to eliminate Damien, Damien himself crashes in and starting a bloodbath and taking a man back to his headquarters. Damien's men gather round to witness and enjoy the scene of a computer possessed by a horror scarfing the man down. A newbie in the gang also witnesses the same. Damien explains that he feeds the horror in exchange for information. Gina plots to obtain Damien's DNA by seducing him and providing a 60 seconds frame for Sword to enter the floor. At a pool party, she kisses Damien, obtaining his DNA on her lips, and shuts the security system down quickly. Sword, using his intense strength, pries into the floor. As soon as the system comes back on, Sword is faced with the horror computer while Gina is caught by Damien and his minions. However, the newbie, feeling disturbed by Damien's methods, helps her out, saving her. Combating the horror, Sword transforms into his Garo armor and skillfully slays it. The two successfully execute the mission, bringing Damien's demise. Back together at the bar, Gina bids Sword goodbye, leaving him with a hefty bill to pay. A classic Gina style. Sophie stands arguing with the waitress at the diner to tell her of Sword's whereabouts. She is desperate to find her brother Martin Hennis, who went missing, with the only clue being El Dorado. Back at her orphanage, her roommate tells her of the weird missing case of Father Ripley and off she goes to investigate. She arrives at the father's neighborhood and finds his sister Maria, woman known for her beauty. Sophie learns that Maria's father's little sister with the father and Martin missing. The two reminisce about their lost brothers together. Suddenly the doorbell rings. Into Sophie's utter surprise, it's Sword. Sword steps in and hands Mary a bouquet of flowers before quickly fleeing the scene, ignoring Sophie. Back at Marie's, they resume talking about their brothers. While telling of her brother, Marie suddenly grows twisted, frustrated at her brother banning her from the amenities of life due to her beauty. She squeezes Sophie's hand painfully. Sophie runs into the basement, disturbed by her behavior, only to find the decaying head of Father Ripley. As she absorbs reality, Marie breaks and crawls through the roof, making Sophie realize she's a horror. However, Sword crashes in before Marie can attack, saving Sophie once again. This time Sophie attempts to help him by throwing down a massive church bell at Marie. Although Sword once again eliminates the horror, Sophie is pulled along with the bell but is in time saved by Zaruba. As Sword walks off, Sophie tearfully tells in her desperation to know about El Dorado and her brother's disappearance. Getting on his bike, he turns and asks her if she likes some tacos. First at the diner, Gina and Sword have a meal. When Sophie arrives, decided and determined, she resumes her bickering with Sword as Gina classically leaves once again without paying. Sword is surprised when Sophie tracks him to his residence. There she learns that Sword is himself in the turmoil of a lost sibling. As Luke and Swords eat at the diner, a mission surfaces of missing people, with one of the victims mentioning El Dorado. Sword immediately gets up to leave, telling Sophie to stay back. When she attempts to follow, he and Luke scout for clues, finding that all the victims were communicated via the internet. Being good at the internet, Sophie easily browses about a team of players who also went missing and had mentioned something about finding happiness with El Dorado. She gets a pointer about a shack where the group met when offline and informs Sword. Appreciating her, he sends her home while joining Luke to investigate. They arrive at the shop and find the missing people tied up and a chart marked with targets. The horrors will attack. Sophie's orphanage seems to be a target as well. Fearing Sword immediately leaves for her while Luke calls an emergency. However, things have turned grave and there seems to be a bloodbath around the city at the orphanage. Sister of the head of the orphanage delivers the good news to the children about a camping trip. The doorbell rings in. A man representing the association that has gifted the trip to the orphanage. The man they immediately pack with his uncomfortable smile plastered. Sophie and sister soon realize it's a horror. Sister stands strong defending her children while Sophie gets the rest to safety and returns for her, crying and calling for a sword. To her horror, she finds sister gravely injured. Suddenly a strange man resembling Luke walks in, killing the horror and then sister. He turns to Sophie. The king of El Dorado summons you, he mutters. However, before he can get to Sophie, Luke and Sword arrive guarding her. Sword towers before the man guarding Sophie. He bolts out attempting to escape. However, Luke immediately gets on his tail while Sword escorts Stuffy to fight long safety. Meanwhile, Luke engages in a fierce clash with the man. It turns out that he's the former Silver Knight who abandoned his path, becoming a Dark Knight and embracing evil in greed for immense strength. Sprouting the same hair as Luke's, he's revealed to be his harsh father. He taunts Luke for being a fledgling and delivers serious injuries to him just as he's about to kill him. Swords crashes, saving him and facing the knight himself. At the restaurant, an emergency has been announced with everyone clamoring to attempt and protect the city and build defense lines. Fei Long tries to cool down Sophie, still shaken at the loss of her beloved sister. Myphon, striking her dong, straightens her up to be strong and takes her to the basement to keep her safe. However, even there they are attacked by horrors attempting to take Sophie away. Back in the city, the two knights are in an impressive clash, turning everything a rubble around them. The Dark Knight offers Sword to join El Dorado of degrading his strength that protects, insisting as no meaning, and the weak Arctic die, remembering his dear sister who felt evil. Sword grows and rage and abandons his sword. He takes the knight with his bare fists, best weapon and brute strength. He strikes him down, gravely injured. However, the knight escapes, telling him to sharpen his blade until the next time. The city that night ends with an air of deep melancholy. At sister's funeral, Sophie stands quiet as the mourners pay their respects. Her heart grows heavy as her roommate wails, crying out for sister. Luke lies in his bed covered in bandages and healing talismans as Sword brings in food, eating himself quietly. Sword gazes at the destruction of the city around, swearing to not allow this many casualties again, and leaves, wishing Luke to get well soon. Later, the Dieter waitress communicates Sword as orders. She informs that El Dorado seems to lie in the west. He is ordered to leave for, together with Sophie, a 3-day trip to their first stop, San Del Dio. Sword leaves Russell City with Sophie, leaving Luke and Fei Long's care and Meffing nursing him, embarking on her first ever journey. Sophie is dazzled by the world outside. On their way, Sophie comes across an injured fawn and insists to wait until it's safe. Although she's dragging Sword down, he gives in. However, the fawn's mother soon arrives and takes it away. When Sword returns, he finds a teary-eyed Sophie reminiscing about sister who had taken care of her just like the fawn's mother. She embraces Sword, breaking down crying. That night Sword tells her to remain strong and the two continue the journey. The next morning somewhere the Dark Knight meets up with a woman and a man informing of the Garo Night Sword. The three seem determined to serve the king of El Dorado. With the people in the city in despair, the horrors are rising. Luke, now a lot better, is back to work. That night he remembers his family. His father, the Dark Knight, was a well-reputed silver knight who gave up his weight and greed for strength. His mother Adelaide, who had found out about his endeavors and discouraged them, had fallen to him and died before Luke. The next day, before leaving the city to join the others in the El Dorado case, he visits a memorial for those who passed away. Luke, witnessing the scene, remembers his mother's last words telling him to always dedicate his strength to protect and not to obtain like his father pain. But renewed, he resolves to dedicate his strength to protecting people. He bids goodbye to Fei Long and A Fang and the staff at the restaurant. However, before leaving he asks Mei Fang to give him a massive punch. A sheriff Fulfill hands a woman named Natalie a wanted poster of a huge man wanted for kidnapping minors. He informs her that the man was last seen with a child heading towards their location, San Del Dio's. Sword and Sophie arrive at San Del Dio's. They are greeted with much hospitality and sit together at bar feasting. As Natalie tells them about the town, they had been in a dire situation with law and order since the police and government had abandoned them, but with Ophil's help sprung back, protecting their town themselves. Unknown to them, Wolfil is a horror, and all this is his grand plan to procure Sophie. Sophie leaves the table to use the restroom. Upon exiting she finds Natalie, who takes her out to a cop car where they'll fill inside, repeating that she's safe. Sophie grows confused and calls out for Sword, but is forced into the car and taken away. Meanwhile, Sword is given a hard time as all the residents swarm him with arms and chain his bike. He finds himself helpless to attack them since they are humans and not horrors, a clever tactic used by the horror. Just as he flails, his bike comes crashing with Gina riding it out on a highway. Natalie realizes that Alphil is not human and protects Sophie. Sword also arrives in time and slays the sheriff. However, a man the same who the Dark Knight met claiming to be Bishop seems to be controlling him. He blows the town up and disappears. Sophie is delighted to see Gina and the three continue on the journey together. In a desolate area, a man asked a motel owner for a missing friend who had stayed there and gone missing. Not having anywhere to go, he stays there for the night only to be gobbled up by a liquid-like horror that attacks him from the bathtub. Harbored by the owner's Sword, Gina and Sophie arrive at the slums abandoned by the authorities. Further west they stop by a cliff planning to camp when Sophie spots a motel. Delighted that they can rest on a bed for the night, they check into the motel. Sophie also makes friends with the owner's boy, who opens up to her about his family's hard times. Later that night Gina and Sophie take a bath together while Sword raves about that sacredness of melons. Outside the door they lightly chat with Sophie, asking Gina if she likes someone. Suddenly the horror bursts through the bathtub, attacking them, but Gina quickly takes control. Meanwhile, in the basement the wife of the owner finds her husband and the horror that he fed for money. The horror, angry at failing to devour Sophie and Gina, possesses him and attacks her, but before it reaches her, Sword intervenes and saves the woman, leaving her and her son to safety. East slays the owner. Later on, Gina replaces their memories with them remembering their motel being blown by a tornado and killing the owner. Once again the three leave to continue. The trio stops for the night and tries to pinpoint where El Dorado might be. Gina suggests going to the Land of Guidance and being directed to El Dorado, a place of the trial for the Mackay alchemists. Making their way they reach a village, Fair Sail, a Mackay village built on woven reeds islands floating on the lake. Arriving at the village, Gina is swarmed with children. The elder also reaches them and Gina bows in respect. The elder tells them that earlier Luke had dropped for a trail as well. Later on, Gina and Sophie go shopping for advanced arms while Sword chats with the elder. She warns Sword that Sophie is destined to shake the world in near future. At night the elder blesses Gina and the residents escort them there. They reach the temple that connects to the land, revealing itself under the full moon. As they enter, Gina's trial begins and she has to show her resolve in order to be guided. A Pack of wolves advances toward her. Gina springs in the air attacking the wolves with vials, but from it emerges a bulky opponent. He hits her hard, sending her flying. However, Gina is determined and defeats it through the earth's mana. Upon victory, the guardian of the temple possesses Maya, Gina's pet, and speaks through it. He directs them where El Dorado is located. They learn that the king of El Dorado is the entity that forged an ancient ring of pure evil through which it possesses a host to indirectly carry out evil and control horrors. Suddenly Sophie gets a vision of her brother calling for help, and the guardian, returning Maya to normal, leaves them the stone of protection. However, the stone requires will in order to protect its wielder, and Gina hands it to Sophie for her safety. Buses filled with people pass through slums, entering a magnificent metropolitan city. A woman sitting inside gratefully chirps how they're lucky to have made it to El Dorado to a strange man. However, she finds him missing. The man wanders around the city asking randomly about King, and when not getting information, he gobbling the people down. A horror after King, greedily trying to get his hands on the power King holds. However, the intruder hasn't gone unnoticed. Bishop is aware. Sitting at park, the man notices the woman from the bus being approached by another man complimenting her. He gives her free passes to a popular club in the city. Later on, the woman arrives at the club, a vibrant, lively place. She finds herself having fun until the announcer on stage puts her and two more in the spotlight as special guests. To her horror, one by one the crowd, which happens to be horrors, start eating them. She tries escaping but stumble into the strange man, who rips her heads out and then proceeds to kill everyone else. After his bloodbath, he drives the announcer and reaches King's Tower. Unknown to him, the bishop has already put Queen, the woman present at the meeting, with Dark Knight at his tail. The man enters to find himself confronted by the Queen, a horror loyal to King. She mercilessly faces him, delivering severe injuries and making him scurry back outside into the city, where he is found by Bishop and sliced to death by the Dark Knight, putting an end to his endeavor. The Dark Knight seemed to have been training for the sword's arrival inside. The Queen lays loyal and promises to never let anyone lay finger on King. Humming, the Bishop enters the lab of Dr. Stanley, a gruesome-looking horror working on a platoon of horrors aiding Bishop's plan. He plans to attack Sword when the time comes. While Sword dines with Gina and Sophie at a remote restaurant, suddenly the sky grows dark with the ground shaking. The hybrids make their way towards them, with Bishop leading. Sword leaves Sophie in Gina's care, who drives away while he, transforming into his Garo armor, goes right into combat together with Zaruba. Gina and Sophie aren't left alone. A group of airborne horrors follows them with Gina's guidance. Sophie manages to shoot some down just as they celebrate victory. Horror almost snatches away Sophie at excellent timing. Luke drops in and with a newly polished skill set shoots every horror down, but Bishop is not done, and now comes a massive multi-headed horror, flipping Gina's card, almost dropping Sophie in a portal. Sword zaps across with Zaruba, catching Sophie and preventing her to be taken. The three, Luke, Gina and Sword, fight the horror while Zaruba hides Sophie to safety, attempting to flee. Once again they are met with the Dark Knight himself, with Sword and the others not present. Zaruba has no choice. He drops Sophie off, telling her to always move forward, and rams into the Knight, blowing himself up. Sargina and Luke arrive to find the chaos, but the Knight is still alive, clasping a broken Zaruba in his fist. Sword absorbs his energy and transforms into the Golden Knight. However, the Dark Knight once again disappears, telling Sword to prepare. With Zaruba lost, Sophie cries while Sword comforts her with her weapons and car lost. Gina returns to the land of guidance to obtain arms, while Luke, Sword and Sophie finally enter the magnificent El Dorado. The three of them find a hideout and wander out to inspect the city. At night they find that the city is filled and run by horrors, with every product made by Garden Corporation. A massive building stands with the same logo as the company. Sophie discovers that the city has a separate network, AldoNet, and joins it to get more information. There she is given a message by an anonymous user inquiring about the Golden Knight and asking to come and meet him. Luke also discovers various gathering points of horrors, including the club, finding them to be feeding grounds for horrors. Following the anonymous message, they meet a man in hiding who has discovered the city's reality and had hacked to find that Garden Corporation controls everything. Upon the corporation hunting him down, he had went into hiding, waiting for Sword. The Golden Knight to arrive suddenly. They are notified to be found by the Horrors. Sword leaves to fight them off as Luke struggles to find targets to shoot. The man transfers all data to Sophie. Suddenly Sophie has a hallucination of a girl. Her mind floods with the Horrors' location and she tells them to Luke, helping him shoot the monsters down. With the mess resolved, the three of them help the man escape back to safety through a dock. However, before leaving he tells Sophie of her brother Martin Hennis being a key programmer for the El Dorado. Sophie sits on a couch scrolling through the data source, huddles near peering in as she explains that the company seemed to have merged with Cygnus Room Tech and made it big. The name rings a bell for Sword. It's the one where the explosion happened, killing his sister at dawn. They stand overlooking the city's landscape with Sophie missing her brother. Sarah comforts her, assuring her that as the most powerful Mackay Knight he'll protect her. They are interrupted by Luke informing them of trouble. The trio rise at the garden building. Inside they find a man being attacked by a carnivore flower pot and save him. As they make their way to find more survivors, they are met with the Queen. She attacks them with her pods, distracting them as the man reveals to be Dr. Stanley and finally snatches Sophie away. Sophie is brought down to the Chamber of Secrets. At her first chance she makes a run and finds herself in an office labeled with her brother's name. Inside she finds her brother's possessions and his writing stating his wish to work on his research and create a perfect place for his sister. She also finds letters written to him by her, but Sophie never wrote any letters. However, the Doctor and the Queen find her. They proceed to take her along but are stopped by Luke's sword. As Luke tries to stall the Queen's sword runs after the Doctor, he manages to stop him, but out comes the Bishop. He mercilessly plops a bomb in Stanley's mouth, causing a blast and rendering Sword weak. Dragging Sophie along, he throws her down into a pool of water. Just as she drowns, Sword jumps after Sophie, wakes up to find Martin Hennis, her brother, before him, while Sword finds himself sitting at a table with his sister alive and well. Martin pulls Sophie in an embrace. In his middle finger sits the ancient ring of evil. He brings her to a utopian world, virtual world, claiming he created for Sophie a place with eternal happiness. As he takes her out, Sophie is disturbed to see everyone referring to him as the king. Meanwhile, Sword confronts his sister Lizzie, starts telling him of El Dorado, explaining that it's a place filled with stolen souls of humans hunted by the Horrors. The reason why she thrives in the world is due to her Golden Knight bloodline. All of a sudden they are swarmed with horror bots designed to find faults in the system. Lizzie and Sword run and hide. She continues explaining that to further his research and create El Dorado, the Horror found a genius, Martin Hennis, and used him to bring it to reality. Soon it will put the Eldonet worldwide and steal human souls all around. Sword has to prevent it. Sophie is realizing that her brother is behind the deaths of so many. Seeing the ray in his hand, she realizes that he's being used as a pawn by the ancient Horror with no knowledge of reality to create such a world. She desperately tries to convince him through a glitch. Lizzie suddenly steps in front of the siblings, making sure that Sophie is alive too. Sophie's delight, Sword drops in from above calling for Sophie but is blocked by the Queen. Sophie glances down to see her brother's twisted shadow. Making a harsh decision, she pushes him down, falling along with him. Meanwhile, Lizzie wakes Sword up, sending her back from the virtuality. Sword wakes up to find Gina and Luke with him back in El Dorado. Martin, wide-eyed, witnesses the bodies of the humans whose souls were taken. He feels Sophie tight in her hands around his neck. She'll be the one to kill the King. Martin panics seeing the bodies of the humans he thought were living a utopian life. Scared of his sister resolving to suffocate him to death, he runs away and hides, curling up in a ball and perplexed he questions reality. Meanwhile, Sword, Gina and Luke make their way to the building to save Sophie, with Sword explaining everything to them. On their way they are intercepted by the Queen, who attacks them with horrors. However, Luke and Gina stall her, allowing Sword to make his way towards Sophie. Martin, panicking, runs around trying to contact Queen, Bishop or the Knight, but finds the security system down. He is unable to understand the behavior of her sister and the things she's speaking of. All he knows is that he wished to give his sister a better life and took interest in the research work of the company. When he was contacted to become the head of the project, he accepted and was given the ring through Queen. Day and night he worked hard, but now it all seems confusing. Wandering around And witnessing more bodies he grows maniac. Outside, Luke and Gina clash with the Queen. Quick and coming, she's hard to defeat, however together with Gina Luke is able to make a perfect shot, turning the Queen to dust. Meanwhile, Martin arrives at the lobby in a disheveled state and finds Sophie there. Sensing something's wrong, Sophie steps back. The ring on Martin's finger glows red and a horror with multiple faces emerges from it, taking over Martin and transforming him into a red-eyed horror. Martin's face protrudes from the horror's body, calling out to Sophie. Bishops witnesses the scene unfold before him, satisfied to see the ancient horror finally make an appearance as Sophie falls to her knees behind her. Sword arrives at last. Martin's face calls out desperately for his sister through the horror, but it contains him, drowning Martin in its body. The horror attacks them, however Sword manages to hide within the city with Sophie. Meanwhile, Gina and Luke attempt to evacuate the last of the residents while an injured but alive Queen arrives at the bishop and the city. Sword and Sophie are swarmed with millions of horrors. Suddenly bike zaps through the crowd, stopping before them. It's Aruba with Saraba awoken. The two escape the city together with the residents and meet with Luke and Gina. Believe that Sophie's safe, they need to eliminate the horrors now. The ancient horror awakens his three blades, the Queen, Bishop and Knight, and puts the Eldo net worldwide. Millions of souls get sucked in all around the world. Their bodies fall so less to the ground. Through a glitch, Lizzie manages to inform Stewart of the situation. She tells him that in order to push stop to EldoNet he has to access the special storage unit, which needs the access of Martin but can be opened through Safiya as well. Safiya's protection stone glows red as she finds her will to protect those in need and realizes her role. She makes her way to the others and expresses her wish to protect the people. Make a wish. Gina hung Sophie and she jumps on the sword on Zerubbabel. Before they leave, Gina sends Sword off with a kiss. Just then the Knight and the Queen appear before them. Luke and Gina stay behind to face them while Sword together with Sophie makes it back to the city. Sword crashes into the Elder Net together with Sophie and meets with Lizzie once again while Swords fights with the horrors. Lizzie and Sophie leave for the storage unit where Sophie attempts to find the deactivation password. Outside, Queen and Gina, Knight and Luke engage in a lethal fierce battle while fighting the horrors inside. Eldo. Sword gets swallowed by the king and freezes inside him. Meanwhile, Safiya and Lizzie are intercepted by the bishop at the unit, adding more to the mess inside. The king's sword seems to have fallen, however to its bewilderment he stands back up and assaults his world entirely, breaking through the core. Sword attacks the king, slicing it in half. Lizzie senses the king's disappearance and quickly tells Sophie that the only way to save her brother is to destroy the unit. Sophie, frustrated and wanting to protect more than ever, grows strong in her will, making the protection stone around her neck glow. It finally acts up, showing her the password through an illusion of her and Martin. Finally, Sophie manages to access the unit and bring down the Eldo net. With the net down, Lizzie bids her goodbye and asks her to take care of Sword before disappearing in the city. Gina manages to put an end to the Queen, killing her for good while Luke struggles against the Knight. However, sensing the end of Eldo, he leaves Luke be. Sword zooms through the space towards the exit gate out of King's broken self, relieved that he can finally go home and have a meal. However, his endeavors are interrupted when the Dark Knight once again appears before him, burning trouble. The Dark Knight stands before Sword. He claims his contract with the ring has now been broken, hence he stands before him willing to clash out his free will. Sword accepts the challenge and charges toward him with his brute strength, transforming into his Garo armor. He accelerates to give him the piece of cake he's so desperate to get. Sophie wakes up back from the Eldo to find Luke and Gina. Immediately she asks them of Sword, only to find their expressions plain. Meanwhile, Sword impressively clashes with the Dark Knight and stabs through his chest, putting an end to the duel. The Knight mutters for being a good clash before he's killed. Outside, Sophie makes a scene, crying and wailing due to Sword's absence, wanting to save him as she sobs. Luke raises his gun and Sophie realizes what he's about to do and begs Gina. However, Luke had been asked this by Sword. He shoots into the skies, summoning rain and erasing her memories for good. 1 year later, the city believes the calamity it went through was due to a hurricane. Sophie, being the eldest, spends her days taking care of the children at the orphanage. However, she often spaces out and feels lost. One day she accidentally pierces her finger and suddenly remembers pieces of her memories. Finding a promised stone necklace in her old clothes, she recalls everything and bolts to the diner. There she finds Gina and is relieved to know that sword as well. Finally she expresses her wish to become one of the Mackay. The waitress skates out serving a slice of cake, token from the boss approving her wish and allowing her to continue with the diner. As they leave, Sophie spots a stuffed sword stepping out from one of the doors. Seeing her, he returns back. In the end, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more amazing videos.